South Africa's first National Assembly Speaker in the country's democratic dispensation, Dr Frene Ginwala, will be cremated today, we indicated, in a private ceremony. Tributes continue to be paid to her life. The latest now, we're joined by former DA leader Tony Leon. Mr. Leon, thank you very much indeed for making time. I do understand that you're out of the country, so we appreciate you taking time to speak to us. What's your recollection?
I'm just on holiday.
On holiday? Well, thank you for finding a shirt then to put on for us. Thank you so much indeed. What's your recollection of Dr Frene Ginwala as Speaker of the National Assembly?
Oh, I have a lot of memories, rich memories, most of them good, a few bad ones. We had a few clashes, appropriate. I was leader of an opposition party. She was the speaker. And her job was to keep control and order. And I have to say that by and large, she did that. And if you cast your mind back to the 1994 Parliament and for the 10 years that she presided as its speaker, those were fairly tumultuous times. And there were some very big personalities. Nelson Mandela was president, Thabo Mbeki, F.W. de Klerk, deputy presidents, a very rich bench on the ANC side, quite a lot of us on the opposition side who were not known to keep quiet. And I have to say Frene had an authority that she imposed appropriately at times. And bear in mind that she was the first speaker, as you said, of the Democratic Parliament, but she entered Parliament without a day's experience in the legislature. But she did come with very good credentials. She had a DPhil from Oxford University. She had a very impressive liberation pedigree. But she didn't have the parliamentary experience. But she very quickly established control, even though a lot of folk in that parliament had been there for decades. And she was fair. That was the overriding impression. I think with one exception, she did the job with exemplary excellence. There was, I think, one cloud over her speakership, which was the arms deal, where she allowed the parliamentary control over that to slip away. But that is one exception to an otherwise, I think, excellent speakership.
Yeah, and I wanted to come back to what you mentioned earlier. I mean, there's always, as it should be, heated exchanges between the majority party and the opposition in the National Assembly. You've obviously alluded to that as well. I mean, overall, how do you think she handled that? Because even though she is or was a member of a political party, it certainly was her job to carry out her duties in an impartial way.
So I think she did better than any of her successor speakers. Now, you might say, well, that's not a very difficult achievement, but actually it was. And unfortunately, I think the problem was that after she left in 2004, most of the speakers since then, right through to today, saw their job as protecting the interests of the ANC rather than protecting the interests of Parliament. Frene, let's be quite clear, was a strong ANC partisan who'd been in exile and was in the top tier of the ANC leadership. But she did actually have a very high regard for Parliament itself and to establish it as an autonomous body which would check and control the executive. And by and large, with the exception of the arms deal, as I mentioned, she did that. And I think, in fact, she said on one occasion, repeated in my book, On the Contrary, she said the problem with the ANC is that because of exile and the conditions of being outside the country, fighting a war against the government, there's a kind of no questions asked sense of solidarity and a jackbooted approach to authority, or words to that effect, which it doesn't always sit well with constitutional democracy. So Frene Ginwala was aware of that issue. And I think on a human and on a political level, she did her best to overcome it by actually saying, I'm going to set up my stall as a speaker whose job is to primarily protect the interests of the members of Parliament from all sides. And so what she did was to give opposition parties, and this was sort of the early days of Parliament, an equal shot and in holding the majority party to account. And look, it was also helped by the fact that the president, Nelson Mandela, who was both close to her personally politically, himself had a very high regard for Parliament. So working in tandem with a president who had a very significant regard for the importance of Parliament and a speaker who echoed that, I think you had a very good combination.
You touched on, some of the difficult decisions. You spoke about the arms deal, and what do you think were some of the other most difficult decisions that you think she had to take in relation to her work?
Well, look, the arms deal was a blight because she basically she agreed to allow parliamentary oversight to be removed, and to Andrew Feinstein and Gavin Woods were sidelined, and that was, I think, to the eternal shame and regret of Parliament doing its job. But she allowed, for example, question time. So we never used to just have these questions that ministers sometimes don't feel like answering. We had interpellations. You would have mini debates within questions. There was a whole from the previous regime, but she allowed it to continue into the new Parliament. And, I suppose the biggest challenge for Parliament in the first 2 years between 94 and 96 was to enact a new constitution. And she also played a very big role in that. Even though Cyril Ramaphosa was chairman of the Constitutional Assembly, she was very much part of the negotiations around that. And when Parliament itself as a body had to enact that constitution, she was front and center of that. And I think that was that obviously was the high water mark of both the first Parliament and her speakership in it. Look, the other issue at the time was that 94%, I think, of all members of Parliament were part of the government of national unity, leaving only 6% of us. That was my party, the DP, the Freedom Front, the PAC and the ACDP outside that government of national unity. So you had a very odd situation where most of the parties were in government and very few were outside it. And her job was to make sure that there was a vibrancy in Parliament that wasn't just stifled by a conformity because so many members were theoretically part of one government. And she did pretty well on that score as well, I think. And look, I think symbolically that first Parliament was where she presided was noteworthy. The fact that we had this incredible cast of international characters coming to address it. And one thing that stood out to me during the visit of President Bill Clinton was Frene's determination that it was a very big occasion in Parliament, and President of the United States. She said we must have an opposition member to actually thank him, not just a government member. And so she called on one of my colleagues, the late Dean Smuts, to deliver the vote of thanks. And I thought there was a lot of symbolism in that, because she was really saying to the president of a very powerful democracy, look, we might be an ANC majority here, but we do have regard for opposition parties, and this lady from the Democratic Party is going to thank you. And so in many symbolic ways, I think she asserted the rights and privileges of Parliament, and a Parliament of many parties, not just of one party.
Mr. Leon, we appreciate your time this morning on the agenda. Thank you very much indeed. The former leader of the Democratic Alliance, paying tribute to Dr. Frene Ginwala, who will be cremated in a private ceremony today.